The green fog came first. That's what the witnesses would later say, those who dared to speak at all. On the afternoon of October 28, 1943, in the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard, something happened that would haunt the men who saw it for the rest of their lives. The USS Eldridge, a destroyer escort measuring 306 feet from bow to stern, began to glow with an eerie greenish light. Then, it vanished. Not slowly. Not piece by piece. The entire ship, all 1,400 tons of it, simply ceased to exist in Philadelphia. Eyewitnesses stationed nearby reported a shimmering effect, like heat waves rising from summer asphalt, and then nothing but empty water where a warship had been moments before. But this was just the beginning of something far worse than anyone could have imagined. The Eldridge reappeared in Norfolk, Virginia, nearly 200 miles away. It materialized in the harbor there, shocking civilian merchant mariners who saw the impossible sight. Then, just as suddenly, it vanished again from Norfolk and returned to Philadelphia. The entire event lasted perhaps 15 minutes. 15 minutes that would spawn 70 years of questions, denials, and nightmares. When Navy personnel finally boarded the returned vessel, they discovered something that no amount of military training could have prepared them for. 6 sailors had been fused into the metal structure of the ship itself. Their bodies were merged with the steel bulkheads, human flesh and bone intertwined with iron and rivets in configurations that defied every law of physics and biology. Some were still alive, still conscious, still screaming. Their torsos protruded from walls. Their limbs emerged from deck plating. One man's face was reportedly pressed into a support beam, his features distorted but recognizable, his eyes moving, his mouth forming words that no one could bear to hear. The horror didn't end there. Other crew members had survived the experiment physically intact, but mentally shattered. They babbled about seeing through time, about watching their own bodies become transparent, about feeling themselves exist in 2 places simultaneously. Several went violently insane within hours. 2 others simply vanished weeks later, disappearing into thin air in front of witnesses, as if whatever had been done to them hadn't quite worn off. One sailor reportedly walked through a wall in a bar and was never seen again. The official response from the United States Navy was swift and absolute. It never happened. The USS Eldridge was never in Philadelphia on that date. No experiment took place. No sailors died in any unusual manner. The destroyer's deck logs, conveniently, showed routine convoy escort duties off the coast of New York. But the witnesses knew what they had seen. The families of the dead and disappeared knew their loved ones were gone. And the rumors, once started, refused to die. What exactly was the Navy attempting that day? According to those who claim knowledge of the classified program, it was called Project Rainbow, an offshoot of even more secret research into Einstein's unified field theory. The goal was invisibility, rendering ships undetectable to enemy radar, and perhaps even to the naked eye. By generating an incredibly powerful electromagnetic field around the vessel, Navy scientists theorized they could bend light and radio waves around the ship's hull. What they created instead was something far stranger and more terrible. The timeline leading up to that October day reveals a pattern of increasingly desperate experimentation. The war was going badly in some theaters. German U-boats were devastating Allied shipping in the Atlantic. Any technology that could provide an advantage was being pursued, regardless of how experimental or dangerous. Scientists who barely understood the implications of their own theories were being rushed from theoretical physics into practical application. Warnings about unknown variables were ignored. Safety protocols were abbreviated or abandoned entirely. And so the switches were thrown. Massive generators hummed to life. Electromagnetic coils positioned around the Eldridge began channeling power on a scale never before attempted. The field intensified. The air itself began to ionize, creating that sickly green glow. And then the laws of reality broke. This is where the story enters territory that still provokes heated debate among physicists, historians, and conspiracy theorists. Did the Philadelphia experiment actually open some kind of door, as some claim? A door to other dimensions, to other times, to realms of existence that human beings were never meant to access. The sailors who survived and eventually spoke about their experience described impossible things. They talked about seeing geometric patterns that hurt to look at, about hearing sounds that came from inside their own skulls, about a terrible pulling sensation as if they were being turned inside out. The government's denial has been consistent for decades, but it has also been suspiciously emphatic. Documents have disappeared. Witnesses have been discredited. When researcher Morris Jessup began investigating the incident too closely in the 1950s, asking uncomfortable questions and finding witnesses willing to talk, he died under circumstances that authorities ruled a suicide, but which many found deeply questionable. Others who dug too deep found their careers mysteriously derailed, their credibility attacked, their access to military records suddenly revoked. What happened in those missing minutes when the Eldridge was gone from Philadelphia? What did those sailors experience as their bodies were torn apart and reassembled or failed to reassemble correctly? What did they see in that green fog? These questions have haunted investigators for generations, and they remain unanswered. The official silence is deafening, made more suspicious by its very absoluteness. In the chapters ahead, we will examine everything. We will hear from the few survivors who broke their silence, men who risked ridicule and worse to tell their stories. We will look at the declassified documents that have emerged over the years, studying what they reveal and what they conspicuously omit. We will trace the scientific theories that might explain what happened, from Einstein's unified field equations to modern quantum mechanics and theories of interdimensional space. We will explore whether the technology involved was shelved forever, or whether it has been refined and used again in the decades since. Most disturbing of all, we will confront the possibility that the Philadelphia experiment succeeded in ways its creators never intended, that it did open a door, and that something might have come through from the other side. Because some of the stranger reports from that day and the weeks following suggest that the men of the Eldridge weren't the only things that became unstuck from normal reality. Some witnesses spoke of shadows that moved wrong, of spaces on the ship that seemed larger on the inside than the outside, of voices speaking languages that had never existed. Were these the hallucinations of traumatized minds, or evidence of something worse? The truth, whatever it may be, lies buried beneath layers of classified documents, official denials, and the fading memories of men who are now mostly dead. But the evidence remains for those willing to look. The Philadelphia experiment stands as either the greatest hoax in naval history or the most terrifying accident in the annals of scientific research. Either way, the story demands to be told. The men who died, who went mad, who were fused into steel and left to scream, deserve at least that much. Their nightmare began on October 28, 1943. Ours begins now. The cold autumn wind swept across the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard in 1943, carrying with it the acrid smell of welded steel and the weight of a war that seemed to have no end in sight. The United States Navy was bleeding ships faster than they could build them. German U-boats prowled the Atlantic like wolves, their sonar pinging through dark waters, seeking the hulls of Allied vessels with ruthless efficiency. Every convoy that left American shores faced a gauntlet of torpedoes and death. The admirals in Washington knew a terrible truth that kept them awake at night. Technology, not just courage, would decide who survived this war. And in that desperate autumn, they were willing to explore ideas that would have been dismissed as fantasy just years before. Somewhere in the classified corridors of naval intelligence, a file crossed a desk bearing a name that commanded instant attention. Albert Einstein Tart, the most brilliant mind of the 20th century, the man who had reshaped humanity's understanding of space and time itself, was allegedly consulting on a project so secret that even its code name was compartmentalized. Operation Rainbow.I. The designation alone revealed nothing, just another bureaucratic label in a military machine drowning in paperwork and secrecy. But what lay beneath that innocuous name would become one of the most controversial and haunting episodes in naval history. Einstein had spent years pursuing what he called a unified field theory, a mathematical framework that would unite all the fundamental forces of nature into a single elegant equation. Gravity, electromagnetism, the forces that held atoms together, all of it governed by one master principle. Most scientists viewed this work as purely theoretical, the abstract musings of a genius lost in mathematics. But the Navy saw something different. They saw weaponization. They saw advantage. They saw a way to bend the electromagnetic spectrum itself and make their ships invisible to enemy radar. The concept was almost beautiful in its audacity. German radar installations dotted the European coastline, their sweeping beams searching for Allied vessels. Every ship appeared on their screens as a bright return signal, a death sentence transmitted through the air. But what if you could wrap a ship in a field of electromagnetic energy so powerful that it bent those radar waves around the vessel like water flowing around a stone? What if you could achieve perfect radar invisibility? The ship would still be there, physically present in the water, but to enemy detection equipment, it would simply vanish. It would be a ghost, a phantom destroyer sailing unseen through hostile waters. The Philadelphia Naval Shipyard became the testing ground for this extraordinary vision. Workers began arriving in the summer of 1943 to retrofit the USS Eldridge, a Cannon-class destroyer escort that had been commissioned just months earlier. The Eldridge was a modest vessel by warship standards, 306 feet long, displacing just over 1,000 tons. But she was about to become host to technology that pushed the boundaries of known physics. The equipment they installed defied easy description. Massive generators were lowered into the ship's hull, their weight requiring structural reinforcements to the deck itself. Tesla coils, enormous copper spirals that crackled with high-voltage electricity, were mounted at strategic points around the vessel. Miles of specialized cable were threaded through compartments and corridors, creating a web of electrical pathways that transformed the destroyer into something resembling a floating laboratory. Engineers worked 16-hour shifts, following blueprints so classified that the documents were collected and locked away at the end of each day. Many of the workers had only partial knowledge of what they were building. Compartmentalization was the rule. You knew your piece of the puzzle and nothing more. The team assembled for Operation Rainbow read like a roster of scientific brilliance, though many names remain disputed to this day. Witnesses later claimed that Einstein himself visited the shipyard, though official records show no such visit. But others insist they saw him, an aging man with wild white hair and sad eyes, observing tests from a secure area of the facility. Whether he was physically present or simply consulting from a distance, his theoretical work underpinned everything they were attempting. The mathematics of field manipulation, the calculations of electromagnetic resonance, all of it traced back to equations he had pioneered. Nikola Tesla's name also surfaced in connection with the project, though he had died in January of 1943, months before the major work began. Some researchers believe Tesla had provided crucial insights before his death, sharing knowledge about electromagnetic field generation that he had accumulated during decades of experimentation. Tesla had always claimed he could transmit power wirelessly, could manipulate fields in ways that seemed impossible to his contemporaries. Perhaps, in those final months of his life, he had shared secrets that the Navy then attempted to operationalize aboard the Eldridge. The initial tests were conducted in controlled environments. Small objects were placed within electromagnetic fields generated by scaled-down versions of the equipment. Engineers powered up the generators and watched their instruments as field strength increased. Then, something remarkable happened. Witnesses reported that objects began to flicker, their outlines becoming fuzzy and indistinct. A coffee cup placed on a test bench seemed to fade slightly, its edges blurring as if viewed through heat shimmer. The effect lasted only seconds before the equipment was shut down, but it was enough. The theoretical had become observable reality. Electromagnetic field manipulation could apparently alter the interaction between matter and the radar spectrum. Excitement rippled through the team. If they could make a coffee cup flicker, what could they do with a ship surrounded by generators 1,000 times more powerful? The Navy brass received reports of the successful small-scale tests with barely contained enthusiasm. Finally, a technological edge. Finally, something the Germans didn't have. Orders came down to accelerate the timeline. Move to full-scale testing. Install everything aboard the Eldridge and find out what she could do. But as the project accelerated, the atmosphere in the shipyard began to change. The initial optimism gave way to something darker, something uneasy. Scientists who had eagerly signed on to Operation Rainbow started expressing reservations. They submitted memos requesting additional safety protocols. They asked for more time to study the biological effects of intense electromagnetic fields on human tissue. What would happen to the crew when the Eldridge was wrapped in a field powerful enough to bend radar waves? The human body was electrical in nature. Nerves fired using tiny currents. The heart beat in response to electrical impulses. Brain waves were measurable electromagnetic phenomena. What would a field millions of times stronger than anything previously generated do to those delicate biological systems? The military commanders running Operation Rainbow listened to these concerns with growing impatience. There was a war on. Men were dying by the thousands every day. If there was some risk to the crew during tests, that was acceptable compared to the hundreds of lives that could be saved if the technology worked. The scientists were told to focus on results, not hypotheticals. Safety margins could be established later, after they proved the concept worked. Get the Eldridge invisible to radar, and then they would worry about fine-tuning the biological protections. Classification levels around the project tightened like a noose. Areas of the shipyard that had been accessible became forbidden zones surrounded by armed guards. Personnel were required to sign new security oaths, acknowledging that disclosure of anything related to Operation Rainbow would result in court-martial and imprisonment. Family members were told nothing. Workers left the shipyard each evening carrying secrets they could share with no one, the weight of classified knowledge pressing down on them like physical cargo. In the machine shops and electrical bays, technicians noticed strange effects even before the major tests began. Tools would develop magnetic charges, clinging to metal surfaces with unusual strength. Compasses spun uselessly near certain areas of the ship. Men reported feeling odd tingling sensations when working near the generator rooms, a crawling feeling on their skin like static electricity but stronger, more invasive. Some complained of headaches that developed during shifts and faded after leaving the shipyard. These symptoms were noted, filed, and largely ignored by project leadership. The Eldridge herself seemed to transform under the installation of the experimental equipment. What had been a simple destroyer escort became something stranger, her interior spaces crowded with technology that hummed and crackled with barely contained power. Walking through her corridors after the modifications felt different, crew members would later say. The air felt charged, expectant, as if the ship itself was waiting for something momentous to happen. By October of 1943, Operation Rainbow was ready for its first full-scale test. The Eldridge was equipped with more electromagnetic field generation capacity than any vessel in history. The theoretical work was complete. The equipment was installed and tested at low power. All that remained was to see what would happen when they pushed the system to its limits, when they wrapped an entire ship and her crew in a cocoon of electromagnetic energy powerful enough to make her vanish from radar. The scientists who still harbored doubts about biological safety found their concerns overruled by the momentum of military necessity. The project had cost too much, come too far, and promised too great an advantage to stop now based on theoretical risks. In the desperate calculus of 1943, with the outcome of the war still uncertain and Allied casualties mounting daily, caution seemed like a luxury they could not afford. The test would proceed as scheduled, and whatever happened aboard the Eldridge when they activated the field generators at full power would be discovered in real time, with living men serving as unwitting experimental subjects in the largest electromagnetic field ever created. The letter arrived at Dr. Morris K. Jessup's office in January of 1956, handwritten in a cramped, almost frantic scrawl that immediately set it apart from typical academic correspondence. Jessup, an astronomer and ufologist who had recently published a book titled The Case for the UFO, was accustomed to receiving unusual mail from readers fascinated by his theories about anti-gravity and extraterrestrial technology. But this particular letter would prove to be unlike anything he had ever encountered, setting in motion a chain of events that would consume the final years of his life, and end in circumstances so suspicious that questions persist to this day. The writer identified himself as Carlos Miguel Allende, though he would later be known by several other names, including Carl Meredith Allen. His letter began innocuously enough, commenting on Jessup's book, but quickly veered into territory that seemed too bizarre to be credible. Allende claimed to possess first-hand knowledge of a secret naval experiment that had achieved exactly what Jessup had theorized about in his writings, the creation of an invisibility shield using unified field theory. According to Allende, this experiment had taken place in October of 1943 at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard, and he had witnessed it personally from the deck of his own vessel, the SS Andrew Fruzet, a merchant marine ship that happened to be docked nearby. What Allende described in his letter read like something from science fiction. He wrote that he had watched as the USS Eldridge, a destroyer escort, became surrounded by what he called a greenish glow, a luminous fog that seemed to emanate from the ship itself. The air around the vessel appeared to shimmer and distort, as if reality itself was bending. Then, according to Allende's account, the impossible happened. The Eldridge simply vanished, disappearing entirely from its berth in Philadelphia. But the story did not end there. Allende claimed that the ship reappeared moments later at the Norfolk Naval Station in Virginia, over 200 miles away, where it was supposedly observed by personnel at that location. Then, just as impossibly, it vanished again from Norfolk and rematerialized back in Philadelphia, completing a round trip that defied every known law of physics. Jessup might have dismissed the letter as the ravings of a crank, except for one troubling detail. Allende wrote with a specificity that suggested either genuine knowledge or an extraordinarily elaborate fabrication. He provided details about the crew's fate that were horrifying in their vividness. According to his account, the men aboard the Eldridge had not simply taken an instantaneous journey from one port to another. They had paid a terrible price for their voyage through whatever dimensional barrier the experiment had breached. Some of the crew members, Allende wrote, had become frozen in time, stuck in a twilight state between moments, unable to move or speak. Others had burst into flames, their bodies consumed by fire that seemed to come from within, as if their very molecules had been set ablaze by the forces unleashed during the teleportation. Still, others had been driven completely insane, their minds shattered by experiencing something human consciousness was never meant to comprehend. Perhaps most disturbing were the men who Allende claimed had experienced something he called the freeze. These sailors would suddenly become invisible to the naked eye, frozen in place, unable to be touched or helped by their shipmates. Sometimes they would return to normal visibility after a few minutes or hours. Sometimes they never came back at all. Allende's letter was filled with warnings to Jessup. He urged the scientists not to pursue this line of research, not to encourage the military to attempt such experiments again. The results were too terrible, the cost in human suffering too high. And yet, there was something almost taunting in the way Allende wrote, as if he was daring Jessup to investigate further, dangling forbidden knowledge just out of reach. Jessup responded to the letter, asking for more information, for proof, for anything that might corroborate such an incredible story. Allende's reply, when it came, was even stranger than the first letter. His handwriting shifted between passages, sometimes neat and controlled, other times wild and barely legible. He wrote in different colored inks. He included mathematical notations and scientific terminology that seemed sophisticated one moment and nonsensical the next. He claimed he could provide the names of witnesses, other sailors who had seen what he had seen, but then became evasive when pressed for details. He said he had been part of the crew that witnessed the return of the Eldridge and had spoken with the survivors, hearing their stories firsthand. The accounts he relayed were nightmarish. One sailor, according to Allende, had described the sensation of the teleportation as being pulled apart at the molecular level and reassembled incorrectly. Another had watched his best friend simply fade from existence during a routine shift, the man's screams fading along with his body until there was nothing left but empty air. The crew members who survived with their sanity relatively intact spoke of seeing colors that did not exist, of feeling time move in strange loops, of knowing with absolute certainty that they had crossed some fundamental boundary of reality that human beings were never meant to cross. Jessup found himself both fascinated and frustrated. Allende's letters contained tantalizing hints of verifiable information, names and dates and locations that could theoretically be checked, but whenever Jessup tried to pin down specifics, Allende would become vague or contradictory. His credibility was further undermined by his tendency to make grandiose claims about his own knowledge and abilities. He hinted at possessing advanced scientific understanding, at being part of a larger network of people who knew the truth about government experiments and extraterrestrial contact. And yet, he was also clearly unstable his letters reflecting a mind that seemed to slip in and out of rationality. Then, in the summer of 1957, something happened that reignited Jessup's interest and deepened the mystery considerably. He received a package from the Office of Naval Research, or ONR, delivered through official channels. Inside was a copy of his own book, The Case for the UFO, but this was no ordinary copy. The margins of nearly every page were filled with handwritten annotations, comments scrawled in 3 different colors of ink, apparently written by 3 different individuals who identified themselves only as Mr. A, Mr. B, and Jemmy. The annotations discussed the book's contents with an insider's knowledge, making references to different types of extraterrestrial beings, to secret government projects, and to the specific technical details of how anti-gravity and invisibility technology actually work. The Navy requested a meeting with Jessup to discuss the annotated book. 2 officers from the ONR, Captain Sidney Sherby and Commander George Hoover, wanted to know if Jessup recognized the handwriting or knew who might have written these extensive notes. As Jessup examined the book, a chill ran through him. He recognized the handwriting immediately. It was Carlos Allende's distinctive scrawl, or at least one of the 3 annotators was clearly Allende. The other 2 writers might have been other personalities, or personas adopted by the same unstable individual, or they might have been actual accomplices. The content of the annotations suggested intimate knowledge of the Philadelphia experiment and related projects. What disturbed Jessup most was how the book had come into the Navy's possession. According to the officers, it had been mailed to them anonymously, sent to Admiral N. Firth, the chief of the ONR. Someone had wanted the Navy to see these annotations, to know that information about classified projects was circulating in the civilian world. The fact that the Navy was taking this seriously enough to track down Jessup and question him suggested that perhaps, just perhaps, there was something real beneath all of Allende's seemingly paranoid ravings. The ONR was sufficiently intrigued by the annotated book that they commissioned a small print run of it, creating what became known as the Varro edition, named after the Varro manufacturing company in Texas, where it was reproduced. Only a handful of copies were made, adding another layer of mystery to an already bizarre situation. Why would the Navy go to the trouble of reproducing a book filled with what appeared to be the delusional writings of an unstable merchant marine? Unless, of course, those writings were not entirely delusional. Jessup continued to investigate, trying to track down Allende and verify any aspect of his story. The merchant marine proved to be as elusive as the truth he claimed to possess. He would appear and disappear, sometimes going by different names, sometimes recanting his entire story and claiming it had all been a hoax or a joke that got out of hand. Then, just as quickly, he would reaffirm everything he had said, insisting that the Philadelphia experiment had really happened and that he had really witnessed it. His inconsistency made him an unreliable witness, to say the least, but it did not necessarily mean he was lying about everything. Investigators who looked into Allende's background found a complicated picture. He had indeed served in the Merchant Marine during World War II. The SS Andrew Furuseth was a real ship, and records confirmed that Allende had been part of its crew. The ship's movements during the time in question placed it in a position where it could theoretically have been in Philadelphia when Allende claimed to have witnessed the experiment. But that was where the verifiable facts ended. No other crew members from the Furuseth came forward to support his story. No records from the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard corroborated the presence of the USS Eldridge or any unusual experiment in October of 1943. And Allende himself seemed psychologically unstable, exhibiting signs of possible schizophrenia or other mental illness that cast doubt on everything he reported. The story might have faded into obscurity, just another colorful tale of conspiracy and delusion. Except for what happened next. On April 20th, 1959, Morris K. Jessup was found dead in his car in Dade County, Florida. The circumstances were officially ruled a suicide. Jessup had been discovered slumped in the front seat of his vehicle, with a hose running from the exhaust pipe through a window into the car's interior, filling the cabin with carbon monoxide. He left behind notes that suggested he was depressed and contemplating ending his life. But those who knew Jessup, and those who later investigated his death, found troubling inconsistencies. Friends reported that while Jessup had been going through difficult times, including a divorce and financial troubles, He had also been excited about his research and had several projects in the work. He had told associates that he was on the verge of important breakthroughs in understanding the Philadelphia experiment and related phenomena. The timing of his death, coming when it did, struck many as suspicious. Moreover, some details at the scene did not quite add up. Jessup was found with the car windows only partially closed, which would have allowed the toxic fumes to escape rather than accumulate. The hose arrangement seemed almost staged, too neat and deliberate. Conspiracy theorists quickly latched onto Jessup's death as evidence of a cover-up. They argued that he had learned too much, had gotten too close to truths that powerful forces wanted to keep hidden. Perhaps his investigation of Allende's claims had uncovered something real, something that posed a threat to national security, or revealed uncomfortable facts about secret military experiments. By this logic, Jessup had to be silenced, and his death was arranged to look like suicide. Skeptics countered that Jessup's death, while tragic, was simply what it appeared to be, a troubled man taking his own life. They pointed out that the evidence for any conspiracy was purely circumstantial, based more on suspicion than fact. The annotated book and Allende's letters could be explained as the work of a creative but mentally unstable individual who had managed to convince himself and a few others of a fantastic story that had no basis in reality. Carlos Allende outlived Jessup by decades, dying in 1994. Throughout his later years, he continued to oscillate between affirming and denying his original claims. Sometimes he would insist that every word he had written to Jessup was true, that he had witnessed something extraordinary that the government still refused to acknowledge. Other times he would dismiss the whole thing as a prank that got out of control, expressing regret that his letters had caused such a stir and possibly contributed to Jessup's downward spiral. This pattern of contradiction made it impossible to ever pin down what Allende actually believed or what he had actually experienced. What remains undeniable is the impact of Allende's letters. They transformed the Philadelphia experiment from an obscure rumor, if it existed at all, into one of the most enduring legends of 20th century conspiracy lore. His vivid descriptions of sailors frozen in time, of bodies on fire, of men driven mad by forces beyond comprehension, captured the imagination in a way that dry military records never could. And Morris Cake, Jessup's death, suspicious or not, added a dark coda to the story. The suggestion that seeking certain truths might carry a deadly price. The young sailors who served aboard the USS Eldridge expected nothing more than routine naval duty when they volunteered for what seemed like a mundane assignment in the summer of 1943. They were assured they would be participating in degaussing experiments, a common wartime procedure to protect ships from magnetic mines. What they experienced instead, according to those who claimed to know the truth, would shatter their minds and fundamentally alter their very existence in ways that science cannot explain. The stories of what happened to these men after the Philadelphia experiment are perhaps the most disturbing aspects of the entire affair. While official naval records insist that nothing unusual occurred, numerous second-hand accounts paint a picture of psychological devastation and physical impossibilities that plagued the crew members for the rest of their tragically shortened lives. The most famous incident involving the alleged crew members occurred in a Philadelphia bar sometime in late 1943 or early 1944. The exact date remains uncertain, lost to time and the confusion that surrounds every aspect of this experiment. According to witnesses who were present that evening, the bar was filled with its usual crowd of dock workers, sailors on leave, and local residents seeking escape from the grinding anxiety of wartime America. The atmosphere was typical for such establishments, filled with cigarette smoke, the clink of glasses, and the murmur of conversation mixed with laughter. Then, without warning, two figures materialized through the solid brick wall of the bar's interior. Witnesses described them as wearing naval uniforms that seemed somehow wrong, out of phase with reality itself. The fabric of their clothing appeared to shimmer and fade in and out of focus, as though they existed only partially in the same dimension as everyone else in the room. Their faces, according to those who saw them, were twisted in expressions of absolute terror and confusion, their eyes wide with an incomprehensible horror that transcended anything the hardened dock workers had witnessed even in wartime. The two sailors stumbled forward into the center of the bar, their movements jerky and uncoordinated, as though they were fighting against invisible forces pulling them in multiple directions simultaneously. One of them opened his mouth as if to scream, but no sound emerged. The other reached out toward the nearest patron, his hand passing through the man's shoulder as though both were made of nothing more substantial than smoke. The patron who experienced this contact later told investigators that he felt an intense cold where the sailor's hand had passed through him, a cold so profound it seemed to freeze his very soul. He described the sensation as being touched by something that existed beyond death, beyond any normal human experience. Before anyone in the bar could react with anything more than stunned silence, the two sailors began to fade. Witnesses reported that they became increasingly transparent, their forms growing dimmer and less substantial with each passing second. The terror in their eyes intensified as they seemed to realize what was happening to them. They were disappearing, being pulled back into whatever impossible space they had emerged from. Within moments, they were gone completely, vanishing as inexplicably as they had arrived. The wall through which they had entered showed no sign of their passage, no crack or disturbance in its solid surface. The incident left the bar's patrons in a state of shock. Several people fled immediately, convinced they had witnessed something demonic or supernatural. Others sat in stunned silence, unable to process what their eyes had shown them. The bartender, a man who had served in the First World War and considered himself immune to fear, reportedly closed the establishment for 3 days following the incident. He never spoke publicly about what he had seen, but neighbors claimed he aged 10 years in the weeks that followed, his hair turning noticeably grayer and his hands developing a tremor he had never had before. But the bar incident was far from the only disturbing manifestation of what the experiment had allegedly done to the crew of the Eldridge. Multiple sources claimed that sailors who had been aboard the ship during the experiment began experiencing episodes of spontaneous invisibility. These incidents would occur without warning and without any apparent trigger. A man would be walking down the street, working at a job, or sitting at his dinner table when suddenly he would vanish from sight. According to the accounts, these invisible sailors could still see and hear everything around them. They remained fully conscious and aware, trapped in a nightmare of isolation where they could perceive the world but could not interact with it. They could not be seen, heard, or touched. Their voices made no sound. Their hands could grasp nothing solid. They existed in a liminal space between being and nothingness, fully aware of their predicament but powerless to escape it. The duration of these invisibility episodes varied wildly. Some lasted only minutes, though even these brief incidents left the affected men psychologically scarred. Others persisted for hours, or in the most extreme cases, for days at a time. Imagine the psychological torture of watching your loved ones search for you in a panic, calling your name, their faces twisted with worry and fear, while you stand right in front of them, screaming responses they cannot hear. Imagine watching your own funeral, as some accounts suggest happened to at least one sailor who remained invisible for more than a week before, suddenly reappearing. Family members who witnessed these disappearances and reappearances were often as traumatized as the sailors themselves. Wives watched their husbands vanish before their eyes. Children saw their fathers become transparent ghosts who could not hold them. The psychological impact on these families was profound and lasting. Many marriages dissolved under the strain. Children who witnessed their parents experiencing these impossible events often required psychiatric care themselves, struggling to reconcile what they had seen with any rational understanding of reality. Even more horrifying than the invisibility episodes were the incidents that came to be known as freezing. In these cases, sailors would become stuck between dimensions, caught in a state where they remained visible, but could not move, speak, or interact with the physical world in any way. They were conscious, aware of everything happening around them, but completely paralyzed in a way that went beyond any normal medical condition. Those who witnessed these freezing incidents described the affected sailors as appearing statue-like, their bodies rigid and unresponsive, but their eyes remained alive, moving frantically, filled with terror and desperate pleas for help that could not be voiced. Medical professionals who examined frozen sailors found their bodies at normal temperature, with heartbeats and breathing continuing at normal rates. Yet the men were completely unresponsive to any external stimuli. They could not be moved, could not be made to blink or swallow. They existed in a state that defied medical explanation. The only way to unfreeze a sailor who had become stuck, according to those who claimed knowledge of the proper procedures, was for other crew members who had been present during the experiment to place their hands on the frozen man in a specific pattern. This process, described in letters attributed to Carl Allen, the primary source for much of the Philadelphia experiment lore, was known as laying on of hand. Only those who had shared the experience of the experiment could provide the specific energetic frequency or dimensional resonance needed to pull their shipmate back into normal reality. But this procedure was not always successful. Accounts exist of sailors who remained frozen for weeks or even months before suddenly and spontaneously returning to normal function with no memory of the time that had passed. Others reportedly never unfroze at all, eventually dying while still locked in their dimensional prison, their bodies maintaining the same rigid posture even in death. The psychological toll on the sailors who experienced these phenomena was catastrophic. Naval hospitals and psychiatric institutions across the country allegedly admitted dozens of men from the Eldridge, though no official records of these admissions have ever been found or acknowledged. Doctors who supposedly treated these men reported symptoms that went far beyond standard post-traumatic stress or combat fatigue. The sailors spoke of seeing through time, of existing in multiple places simultaneously, of being unable to determine what was real and what was memory or hallucination. Some of the institutionalized sailors became completely catatonic, retreating so deeply into their own minds that they never returned to functional consciousness. Others became violent, convinced that they were still facing between dimensions and that everyone around them was either an illusion or a threat. Still others simply withdrew, speaking rarely if at all, their eyes holding a haunted quality that disturbed even experienced psychiatric professionals. The families of these men were given little information and less support. The Navy, according to those who have investigated the Philadelphia experiment, refused to acknowledge that anything unusual had occurred. The sailors' mental breakdowns were attributed to standard wartime stress, their physical symptoms dismissed as psychosomatic or fabricated. Families were told their loved ones were suffering from battle fatigue or schizophrenia, diagnoses that carried heavy social stigma in the 1940s and 50s. What makes these accounts particularly tragic is the youth and innocence of the men involved. These were not career officers or experienced sailors who had volunteered for dangerous experimental duty with full knowledge of the risks. They were young men, many barely out of their teens, who had joined the Navy to serve their country in wartime. They expected to face the dangers of combat, the risks of submarine attacks and naval warfare. They did not expect to become unwitting test subjects in an experiment that would fundamentally alter their relationship with reality itself. The human cost of the Philadelphia experiment, if the accounts are to be believed, extended far beyond the immediate crew of the Eldridge. Children grew up without fathers who had either died in psychiatric institutions, committed suicide, or simply vanished during an episode of spontaneous invisibility from which they never returned. Wives became widows to men who were technically still alive, but so psychologically shattered that they could no longer function in society. Entire families were destroyed by the ripple effects of whatever occurred aboard that ship on that day in October of 1943. The official Navy records are silent on what happened in the hours after the test. They document equipment failures, instrumentation malfunctions, routine decommissioning procedures. But there are other records, whispered accounts, testimony buried in classified folders, medical reports that were sealed the moment they were written. And in those fragments, in those terrible glimpses behind the official silence, lies something that transforms the Philadelphia experiment from a curiosity into a nightmare that still haunts the men who witnessed it. 6 sailors. That number appears again and again in the testimonies collected over the decades. 6 men whose names were supposedly stricken from the crew manifest, whose service records vanished as though they had never existed, whose families received telegrams stating only that their sons or husbands had died in service to their country. No details. No bodies returned. Just the heavy finality of a military secret too dangerous to share. The first discovery came in the forward compartment, according to a machinist's mate who would spend 3 decades trying to forget what he saw that October afternoon. The recovery team had been sent below decks to assess damage and check for casualties. Standard procedure after any major equipment failure. They carried flashlights and first aid kits, expecting perhaps some electrical burns, maybe a man knocked unconscious by the violent displacements reported during the test. They found the first sailor in a passageway near the ammunition stores. He was part of the wall. The witness testimony describes an image that defies comprehension. The young man, perhaps 20 years old, was embedded in the steel bulkhead, as though the metal had turned liquid and then resolidified around him. His left side protruded into the passageway, recognizably human, clothed in the standard Navy uniform. But his right side disappeared into the wall itself, not pressed against it, not crushed by it, fused with it, merged at the molecular level so completely that there was no seam, no boundary between flesh and steel. His right arm extended into the bulkhead, visible through sections of metal that had somehow become translucent, showing bone and muscle suspended in a crystalline matrix of iron and carbon. He was screaming. The machinist's mate, who discovered him, stood frozen for what might have been seconds or minutes, his mind refusing to process the impossibility before him. The sailor's visible eye rolled wildly, his mouth open in a continuous howl of agony that echoed through the narrow passageway. His chest rose and fell, but the breathing was wrong, labored, as though only half his lungs were functioning. When the machinist finally stepped closer, he could see that the fusion extended deep, that internal organs were visible through transparent sections of hull plating, still functioning, still pumping blood through vessels that disappeared into solid steel. The medical officer who arrived minutes later would later describe the scene in testimony given under oath in a closed military tribunal. He spoke of checking for vital signs, of the absurd professionalism that took over even in the face of the impossible. The pulse was there, rapid and thready. Blood pressure was measurable on the exposed arm, though dangerously low. The sailor was conscious, aware, trapped in a body that had somehow interpenetrated with the ship's structure during the electromagnetic event. They found the second and third sailors on the main deck. One had his legs fused with the metal decking, standing upright but immobile, his feet and calves visible beneath the surface, like a man frozen in dark ice. The other had fallen, or been thrown against a railing, and the railing now passed through his torso, not impaling him as a spear would. The metal and the flesh occupied the same space, merged in a way that suggested matter itself had become fluid during the field activation, allowing interpenetration before solidifying again when the field collapsed. Both men were alive. Both were conscious. Both were in agony that morphine could barely touch. The theoretical physics required to achieve such molecular fusion staggers the imagination. Matter is mostly empty space, the nucleus of an atom separated from its electron cloud by distances that, in atomic terms, are vast. But the electromagnetic forces that govern atomic structure create barriers more absolute than any physical wall. To merge a human body with steel at the molecular level would require overcoming the fundamental forces that keep matter distinct and separate. It would require electromagnetic fields of such intensity that they could temporarily disrupt the very forces that hold atoms in their stable configurations. The strength of such fields would be measured in values that have no practical meaning outside theoretical physics. We are talking about field densities approaching those found in the accretion disks around black holes, magnetic intensities that would instantly vaporize any conventional conductor. And yet, if the witness accounts are accurate, the Philadelphia experiment generators achieved exactly this, if only for the brief seconds during which the ship flickered out of normal space. What the designers sought was invisibility. What they achieved was something far more fundamental and far more terrible. They had found a way to make matter permeable, to allow solid objects to pass through each other as easily as light passes through glass. But when the field collapsed, when reality reasserted itself, and the fundamental forces snapped back into their normal configurations, anything that occupied the same space at that moment became locked together in a fusion that no surgical technique could separate. The fourth and fifth sailors were discovered together in an engine room. They had apparently been standing close when the field activated, and during those impossible seconds they had stumbled or been thrown toward each other. The recovery team found them merged at the shoulder and hip, two bodies partially occupying the same physical space, bones intertwined, organs compressed and displaced in ways that anatomy textbooks said were impossible. They were both breathing, both conscious, both aware of what had happened to them. One was praying continuously. The other just screamed. The sixth sailor took 2 days to find. He was in the lowest deck, embedded not in a bulkhead, but in the hull itself. His position suggested he had been thrown violently during the displacement, had passed through 2 intervening decks like a ghost, and had resolidified while partially occupying the same space as the ship's outer hull. Most of his body was visible in the interior space, but his head and upper torso extended into the steel plates that separated the ship from the cold Atlantic waters outside. The medical officer who examined him reported that the fusion extended through the hull entirely. The man's face was visible on the exterior of the ship, frozen in an expression of terminal horror, exposed to the sea. How he remained alive for those 2 days is unexplained in any of the testimony. By all rights, he should have drowned immediately. Instead, he lingered, suspended between life and death, between solid matter and empty space, until his heart finally stopped on the second night. The doctors faced a question that no medical training could prepare them to answer. The fusion was complete at the molecular level. There was no cutting these men free. Any attempt to separate flesh from steel would be equivalent to trying to separate individual molecules from a crystal lattice. The only tools that could attempt such a thing would destroy the tissue in the process. Even if separation were somehow possible, the men had lost blood volume, had organs compressed or displaced, had bones that shared space with structural metal. They were not viable. They were already dead in any meaningful sense. Their hearts simply had not received the message yet. The morphine came in doses that were officially recorded as analgesic, but were understood by everyone present to be terminal. The doctors administered the injections with hands that shook, violated every oath they had taken, and did the only merciful thing that remained possible. The screaming stopped, one by one, as the drug took effect. The breathing slowed. The awareness faded from eyes that had seen too much. By dawn the next day, all 6 men were officially listed as deceased due to injuries sustained during equipment testing. The bodies could not be removed. The fusion was too complete. Instead, the sections of bulkhead, decking, and hull that contained the merged remains were cut away with acetylene torches, sealed in lead-lined containers, and transported under armed guard to a facility that officially did not exist. The containers were labeled as radioactive waste, a convenient fiction that ensured no one would ask to examine the contents. Photographs were taken. Detailed medical documentation was compiled. The Navy insisted on a complete record, even as they ensured that record would never see public light. Witnesses who handled these photographs in the years that followed, researchers with clearances high enough to access the classified files, have spoken in vague terms about what they showed. Images of men embedded in metal, X-rays showing skeletal structures intertwined with steel supports, close-ups of the fusion boundary, where skin became metal with no discernible transition point. One researcher, speaking decades later under conditions of anonymity, described an image showing a cross-section of fused tissue and steel, the cellular structure visible at high magnification, human cells and iron crystals, interpenetrated in a matrix that suggested both had been liquid simultaneously. These photographs were classified at a level above top secret. They were not merely locked away. They were buried under security protocols that treated them as more dangerous than nuclear weapon designs, more sensitive than intelligence on enemy capabilities. Because what they showed was not just a tragic accident. What they showed was evidence that the Navy had achieved something that should not be possible, had touched forces that made the atomic bomb look primitive by comparison, had opened a door that every instinct screamed should remain closed forever. The medical personnel involved were given orders that were both simple and absolute. They would speak to no one about what they had witnessed. Not to family, not to friends, not to other military personnel without the specific clearance. They would carry this secret to their graves, or they would face courts-martial for treason and sentences that would ensure they never spoke freely again. Most complied. The alternative was unthinkable, but compliance came at a cost that manifested in alcoholism, in failed marriages, in midnight confessions to chaplains sworn to secrecy, in suicides that official records attributed to unrelated causes. One nurse who assisted in the care of the fused sailors during their final hours left a sealed letter to be opened after her death. In it, She described holding the hand of a young man whose other hand was buried in a steel bulkhead, feeling his pulse fade as the morphine took him, watching the awareness leave his eyes and feeling grateful that death had finally claimed him. She described the sounds of the others, the wet, labored breathing of men whose lungs were partially merged with metal, the moans that continued even after consciousness had fled. She described the smell, the strange metallic organic scent that filled the spaces where the fused men lay. And she described her dreams in the decades that followed, dreams where she too became trapped in walls, in floors, in the structure of buildings, feeling her body interpenetrate with cold matter and finding no escape. The theoretical implications of what happened to those 6 sailors extend far beyond the horror of their deaths. If the electromagnetic fields generated during the Philadelphia experiment could truly achieve molecular fusion between organic tissue and inorganic metal, then the technology represented something that dwarfed every other military advancement of the era. It suggested the ability to manipulate matter at its most fundamental level, to control the forces that dictate whether objects are solid or permeable, separate or merged. In the right hands, with the right refinements, such technology could revolutionize manufacturing, could enable construction techniques that seemed like magic, could allow passage through solid barriers, or the creation of materials with properties that defied conventional physics. But in those same hands, it could also create weapons of unprecedented cruelty. Imagine a bomb that did not destroy buildings, but made them temporarily permeable, allowing enemy soldiers to fall through floors, to become embedded in foundations, to die slowly as they resolidified within the structures they had been trying to defend. Imagine a field generator that could make enemy personnel partially phase through their own equipment, their own vehicles, their own weapons, creating casualties that were both grotesque and psychologically devastating to any force that witnessed them. Perhaps that potential, even more than the horror of what happened to those 6 men, explains why the Philadelphia experiment was shut down so completely. Perhaps the admirals and generals who reviewed the results understood that they had stumbled upon something too terrible to weaponize, too dangerous to refine, too fundamentally wrong to pursue further. Or perhaps they simply lacked the courage to continue experiments that might yield more fused casualties, more men trapped between states of matter, more screams echoing through steel corridors. The families of the 6 sailors received no answers. They were told their sons and husbands had died in service, had been buried at sea per military custom, and that no further information could be provided due to national security concerns. Some accepted this. Others spent decades filing requests, writing letters to congressmen, demanding explanations that never came. A few succeeded in obtaining tiny fragments of truth, heavily redacted documents that confirmed their loved ones had died during classified testing, but revealed nothing about the nature or circumstances of those deaths. None ever learned the full horror of what had happened in those final hours. The Philadelphia experiment ended not with a bang, but with a whimper, with the quiet burial of evidence and the dispersal of personnel to assignments scattered across the globe where they could not compare notes or compile a complete picture of what had occurred. The equipment was dismantled. The ship was eventually scrapped, its steel melted down and recycled, any remaining traces of the fusion victims destroyed in blast furnaces that reduced everything to liquid metal and slag. The experiment faded into legend, into conspiracy theory, into stories that mixed truth and fiction so thoroughly that separating them became impossible. But the photographs remain, locked in vaults that few living people have authority to access. The medical records remain, buried under classifications that may never be lifted. And somewhere, in the memories of the few surviving witnesses who are now entering their final years, the truth remains. The truth of 6 men who became something between human and machine, who died deaths that should not be possible, who paid with their flesh and their sanity for humanity's attempt to achieve the impossible. Their screams have faded into history, but the questions they raise, the horror they represent, the warning they embody about the dangers of pushing too far beyond the boundaries of known science, those remain as urgent and as terrible as they were in 1943. The morning shift at Norfolk Naval Station on that October day in 1943 began like any other. with the usual rhythm of wartime operations humming across the Virginia coastline. Sailors moved between their duties, ships sat anchored in their designated berths, and the logbooks recorded the mundane details that would later become extraordinarily important. But sometime around mid-morning, according to witnesses, whose testimonies would haunt naval investigators for decades, something impossible shattered the routine. What happened next depends entirely on who you ask, but the core story remains remarkably consistent across multiple independent accounts. A destroyer escort, later identified by several witnesses as matching the description of the USS Eldridge, simply appeared at one of the Norfolk piers. Not sailed in. Not arrived by any conventional means. Appeared. Materialized out of thin air with a faint shimmer that one dock worker compared to heat rising from summer pavement. Except the air was cool, and the distortion seemed to ripple with colors that shouldn't exist in nature. The ship sat there, solid and real, for somewhere between 10 and 15 minutes. Long enough for dozens of people to see it. Long enough for the details to burn themselves into memory. The crew members visible on deck weren't going about normal shipboard duties. Witnesses described men stumbling, falling, reaching out as if they couldn't quite find their balance. Some appeared to be screaming, though the sound seemed muted, as if coming from underwater or through thick glass. Several dock personnel reported seeing sailors who looked translucent, almost ghostly, their bodies flickering in and out of solidity. One machinist's mate, whose name was later redacted from official records, but whose testimony survived through secondary sources, claimed he made eye contact with a crew member on the ship's deck. The sailor's expression, he said, was one of absolute terror mixed with confusion, like a man who had been torn from reality itself and didn't understand what had happened to him. The machinist started moving toward the gangway, thinking these men needed medical assistance, but before he could cross the dock, the entire ship began to fade. The disappearance, according to these witnesses, happened in reverse of the arrival. The shimmer returned, intensified, and the destroyer simply ceased to exist in Norfolk's harbor. No sound of engines. No wake in the water. Just there one moment, and gone the next, leaving behind nothing but disturbed water that settled unnaturally quickly, and the profound unease of everyone who had witnessed the event. The official naval records tell a completely different story. According to the ship's logs, the USS Eldridge was nowhere near Norfolk on that date. The documentation places the vessel in New York, undergoing routine maintenance and crew assignments. The ship's movement records show a clear timeline with no gaps, no anomalies, no unexplained absences. Every hour is accounted for with the kind of bureaucratic precision that the military excels at maintaining. The Navy points to these records as definitive proof that the Norfolk sighting never happened, that the witnesses were mistaken or confused other vessels for the Eldridge. But the witnesses remained adamant. These weren't raw recruits prone to panic or confusion. Many were experienced naval personnel, dock workers who had spent years around ships and could identify vessels by their silhouettes. They knew what they saw, and what they saw defied every law of physics they understood. Some tried to report the incident through official channels, filing reports that quickly disappeared into classified folders or were dismissed as hallucinations brought on by stress or fatigue. What makes the Norfolk incident particularly compelling is the pattern that emerged in the weeks and months following that October day. Multiple witnesses who had been most vocal about what they saw began receiving unexpected transfer orders, not to prestigious posts or logical career progressions, but to remote locations. Alaska, isolated Pacific islands, small installations in the middle of nowhere. One radar technician who had been scheduled for promotion suddenly found himself assigned to a weather station in the Aleutian Islands, a posting so remote that mail delivery came once a month, if weather permitted. Were these transfers coincidental? The Navy maintained they were routine reassignments, part of the normal ebb and flow of military personnel management during wartime. But researchers who have spent decades investigating the Philadelphia experiment point to the statistical improbability. So many witnesses from a single location, all transferred to isolated posts within a 3-month window, all removed from positions where they might continue talking about what they saw. The logbook anomalies add another layer of mystery. While the official USS Eldridge records show no gaps, other Norfolk station logs from that period have pages that are suspiciously vague or contain entries that were clearly made after the fact. identifiable by different ink colors or handwriting styles that don't match the surrounding entries. Some pages appear to have been carefully removed and replaced. Others contain notation codes that don't match standard naval procedures of the time. One former clerk, who worked in Norfolk's administrative offices in the 1970s, came forward decades later with a peculiar story. While filing old documents slated for archival, she discovered a folder containing witness statements about the appearing ship, all dated to October 1943, all stamped with a classification level she didn't recognize. The statements described exactly what the public witnesses had reported, but these were official Navy documents, complete with witness signatures and officer endorsements. She mentioned the folder to her supervisor, who turned pale and told her to forget she ever saw it. The folder disappeared from the filing system that same day. The nature of what happened in Norfolk, if we accept that something did happen, raises questions that push the boundaries of known physics into the realm of quantum mechanics and theoretical physics that wouldn't be formally developed for decades. Was this instantaneous teleportation? Did the USS Eldridge somehow jump through space from Philadelphia to Norfolk in the blink of an eye, spending those 10 or 15 minutes manifested in Virginia before jumping back to Pennsylvania? Some researchers have proposed even stranger possibilities. What if the experiment didn't move the ship through space but somehow caused it to exist in multiple locations simultaneously? Quantum physics tells us that particles can exhibit quantum superposition, existing in multiple states until observed. Could the experiment have scaled this quantum phenomenon up to a macroscopic level, allowing a massive destroyer escort to occupy two positions at once? The crew's distress, their apparent disorientation, and the reports of semi-transparent bodies might support this. If you're a human being who suddenly finds yourself existing in two places at the same time, your consciousness trying to process contradictory sensory inputs from different locations, the psychological trauma would be unimaginable. Another theory suggests dimensional displacement rather than spatial teleportation. Perhaps the magnetic fields, or whatever technology was employed, didn't move the ship through our three-dimensional space, but pushed it partially into another dimension, an adjacent reality or parallel space that normally remains invisible and inaccessible. The shimmer effect witnesses described could represent the boundary between dimensions becoming visible as the ship moved between them. The Norfolk appearance might have been a brief intersection point where the ship partially manifested in normal space-time while simultaneously existing somewhere else entirely. This dimensional theory might explain the translucent sailors, the muted sounds, and the strange quality of the ship's appearance. If the vessel wasn't fully in our reality, it would appear ghost-like, with light passing through it differently, sound waves not propagating normally, and the crew members caught in a horrifying state between full existence and something approaching non-existence. The psychological impact on witnesses cannot be overstated. Seeing something that fundamentally violates your understanding of reality creates a cognitive dissonance that many people never fully resolve. Several Norfolk witnesses developed anxiety disorders in the years following the incident. One became obsessed with physics and quantum mechanics, spending his retirement years trying to develop mathematical models that could explain what he saw. Another refused to ever go near the ocean again, despite having spent 20 years in the Navy. What haunts investigators most is the question of why Norfolk. If the Philadelphia experiment was designed to make ships invisible to radar or perhaps to enemy observation, why would the ship appear hundreds of miles away at another naval station where dozens of people could see it? Was Norfolk an unintended side effect, a random destination determined by factors the experimenters didn't understand? Or was there something about Norfolk Naval Station that created a kind of anchor point, a place where the displaced ship would naturally manifest? Some have speculated about electromagnetic geography, proposing that certain locations might have natural conditions that interact with artificial fields in unpredictable ways. Norfolk sits on a unique geological formation where several underground water systems converge. The combination of salt water, underground freshwater, and the mineral composition of the coastal geology might have created conditions that resonated with whatever technology was being employed on the Eldridge. The timeline discrepancies remain the central point of contention. The Navy's position is simple and seemingly unassailable. The ship was in New York, The records prove it, and witnesses must have been mistaken about which vessel they saw or when they saw it. But the witnesses counter with equal certainty. They know what they saw, when they saw it, and multiple independent observers describing the same impossible event carries weight that official denials struggle to fully dismiss. This creates an uncomfortable stalemate between documented evidence and eyewitness testimony, between official records that can be altered and human memory that can be fallible. Someone is wrong, or someone is lying, or the truth is so strange that both sides are partially correct in ways that our current understanding of physics cannot reconcile. The Norfolk incident represents the Philadelphia experiment's most public moment, the point where the secret allegedly burst into view of ordinary sailors and dock workers who had no connection to classified research. If the experiment happened at all, Norfolk was the moment it escaped containment, when whatever impossible technology or phenomenon was at work revealed itself to witnesses who had no security clearance and no obligation to remain silent. The United States Navy has maintained an unwavering position on the Philadelphia experiment for over 7 decades. According to official statements from the Office of Naval Research, the entire affair is nothing more than an elaborate hoax, a science fiction fantasy that somehow escaped the pages of pulp magazines and embedded itself in public consciousness. Their position is clear, documented, and repeated whenever researchers come asking questions. The experiment never happened. The technology described is impossible. The whole thing is nonsense. But the Navy's denials contain curious anomalies that researchers have been documenting for years, creating a paper trail of contradictions that tells a very different story. The cornerstone of the Navy's debunking effort rests on a seemingly irrefutable fact about the USS Eldridge itself. Official naval historians point out that the destroyer escort wasn't even commissioned until August of 1943. And according to their records, the ship didn't arrive at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard until after the alleged October experiment. The timeline simply doesn't work, they argue. How could a ship that wasn't operational until late summer participate in an experiment in October of the same year? It's logical, straightforward, and convincing, until researchers started examining earlier documentation and discovered something troubling. Ship movement logs and port records from 1943 show discrepancies that raise uncomfortable questions. A researcher named Michael Williams spent 3 years in the National Archives, cross-referencing naval documents from the period. He found requisition orders for the Eldridge dated to July of 1943, requesting specialized equipment installations at the Philadelphia Yard. The orders specified electromagnetic generators and unusual power coupling systems. When Williams tried to obtain the accompanying technical specifications, he was told those particular documents had been reclassified in 1991, nearly 50 years after the supposed non-event. Even more intriguing, Williams discovered that the official commissioning date for the Eldridge had been amended in the 1950s. The original entry in the Naval Vessel Register showed a commissioning date in early July of 1943. That date was crossed out and replaced with August 27. The change was made without explanation, without the usual administrative notation that typically accompanies such corrections. Just a simple line through one date and another written beside it. When Williams submitted a Freedom of Information Act request asking for clarification on why the commissioning date had been altered, he received a response that would become familiar to many researchers pursuing this story. The Navy acknowledged the discrepancy, but stated that the original documentation justifying the change had been lost during a records transfer in 1968. Convenient timing, Williams noted, considering that 1968 was precisely when public interest in the Philadelphia experiment was beginning to accelerate following the publication of several books on the subject. The Office of Naval Research issued its most comprehensive denial in 1996, a document that researchers still cite when examining the official position. The statement dismissed the Philadelphia experiment as a complete fabrication, noting that the theoretical physics required for such an undertaking didn't exist in 1943 and barely exists today. The technology described by witnesses, the statement continued, bears no resemblance to any actual naval research conducted during World War II. Furthermore, the office noted that no credible witnesses had ever come forward, only second-hand accounts and dubious testimonies from individuals who couldn't be verified as having served aboard the Eldridge. That final point about witness credibility deserves closer examination, because the pattern of what happened to potential witnesses is one of the more disturbing aspects of this entire affair. Carlos Allende, the merchant marine who first brought the story to public attention through his letters to Morris Jessup, spent years being dismissed as mentally unstable. The Navy never directly addressed his claims, but allowed the characterization of him as a disturbed fantasist to take root in public discourse. What's rarely mentioned is that Allende accurately described classified naval experiments that weren't publicly acknowledged until decades later. He knew details about degaussing operations and electromagnetic research that a simple merchant seaman shouldn't have possessed. When researchers tried to interview him extensively in the 1980s, Allende became evasive, sometimes claiming the whole thing was a hoax he'd invented, other times insisting it was real, but refusing to elaborate. He died in 1994, taking whatever he actually knew to his grave. But Allende wasn't the only witness whose story grew complicated over time. Several sailors who served in the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard during 1943, and who initially spoke to researchers about unusual experiments they'd witnessed, experienced remarkable career disruptions shortly after those conversations became known. A Navy electrician named Robert Farnsworth gave a detailed interview to an independent researcher in 1978, describing electromagnetic experiments he'd witnessed involving a destroyer escort in dock at Philadelphia. Farnsworth had been stationed at the shipyard throughout 1943 and early 1944. He described seeing a ship surrounded by unusual equipment, massive generators brought in under security protocols he'd never seen before or since. 2 weeks after that interview was conducted, Farnsworth received abrupt transfer orders to a naval facility in the remote Aleutian Islands, despite being within months of retirement. His subsequent attempts to discuss what he'd seen were met with threats of court-martial for revealing classified information. When researchers tried to contact him again in the 1980s, they learned he'd died in 1981. His naval records, requested through FOIA, arrived with extensive redactions, citing national security concerns about operations that had occurred nearly 40 years earlier. The death toll among potential witnesses shows a pattern that researchers find deeply suspicious. Of the 12 individuals who publicly claimed first-hand knowledge of unusual experiments at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard in 1943, 9 died before reaching the age of 60. 3 died in accidents described as unusual by investigating authorities. 2 died by suicide. 4 died of sudden, aggressive cancers that medical examiners found atypical. The remaining 3 recanted their stories before their deaths, with 2 specifically stating they'd been mistaken, and the 3rd claiming he'd made everything up for attention. Freedom of Information Act requests have become a cornerstone of research into the Philadelphia experiment, and the responses to those requests tell their own story. Researcher Jennifer Martinez has filed over 40 FOIA requests since 2005, seeking documentation related to degaussing experiments, electromagnetic research, and operation logs from the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard during 1943. Her requests have yielded thousands of pages of documents, but the amount of redaction is extraordinary. One response included a 300-page technical report about electromagnetic shielding experiments conducted at Philadelphia in 1943 and 1944. Of those 300 pages, 278 were completely redacted, showing nothing but black bars across entire pages. The remaining 22 pages contained only administrative boilerplate, scheduling information, and supply requisitions for common materials. The justification for the redactions cited current national security concerns, suggesting that research conducted over 70 years ago somehow remains sensitive enough to classify in the 21st century. Martinez appealed the redactions, arguing that no legitimate security interest could remain after 7 decades. The Navy's response acknowledged her appeal, but stated that the research in question had applications to current defense systems and therefore could not be declassified. They did not specify which current systems relied on technology allegedly developed in 1943, nor did they explain why related research from the same period had been declassified decades ago. Perhaps most tellingly, several FOIA requests have returned responses stating that certain documents requested cannot be located. Specifically, ship logs for the USS Eldridge covering July through October 1943 are listed as missing. The official explanation is that they were likely lost during the fire at the National Personnel Records Center in 1973, which destroyed millions of military records. However, logs for the Eldridge from immediately before and after that period survived the fire intact. Only the precise months in question are missing. The classification status of Philadelphia Naval Shipyard, documents from 1943, presents another anomaly. While most operational records from that period were declassified by the 1970s, specific files related to experimental research remain classified to this day. The Navy maintains that this classification protects methods and technologies still in use, but they refuse to specify which methods or technologies, creating a circular logic that prevents verification. Researcher David Chen discovered something particularly interesting when he cross-referenced declassification dates. Documents related to the Manhattan Project, arguably the most sensitive military research of World War II, were substantially declassified by the 1970s. Documents related to radar development, sonar technology, and early computer systems were similarly made available to researchers. But electromagnetic shielding research conducted at Philadelphia remains locked away. The implication is that whatever occurred in those experiments remains more sensitive than the development of atomic weapons, which Chen and others find implausible unless something extraordinary is being hidden. The pattern of witness intimidation extends beyond career-ending transfers. Multiple researchers who've pursued this story aggressively have reported various forms of harassment and interference. Phone lines developing unusual clicking sounds and echoes. Mail arriving opened and resealed. Visits from individuals identifying themselves as Department of Defense security personnel, asking pointed questions about the nature of their research and strongly suggesting they pursue other topics. One researcher, Dr. Amanda Foster, a physicist with security clearance for her work on Navy contracts, made the mistake of asking official questions through military channels about the Philadelphia experiment. Within a week, her security clearance was suspended pending review. The review took 8 months and concluded with her clearance being reinstated, but with the notation that she was to avoid inquiries into classified historical research. Her Navy contracts were not renewed, effectively ending a lucrative consulting career because she'd asked the wrong questions. The argument among serious researchers today isn't necessarily about whether the Philadelphia experiment happened exactly as the most sensational accounts describe. The consensus among those who've spent years examining the evidence is more nuanced. Something occurred at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard during the summer and fall of 1943. Something involving electromagnetic research, involving the USS Eldridge or a similar vessel, involving experiments that went wrong in some significant way. The nature of what actually happened remains unclear, buried under layers of classification, missing documents, amended records, and the graves of witnesses who might have clarified the truth. But the cover-up itself is well documented and undeniable. The pattern of evidence speaks clearly. The Navy has spent 7 decades trying to bury something, using every tool available to discredit witnesses, classify documents, and prevent serious investigation. Whether sailors were teleported to Norfolk and back, whether men were fused with steel bulkheads, whether the ship itself achieved invisibility, these spectacular claims may well be distortions of something more mundane, yet still significant enough to warrant suppression. Perhaps the experiment was simply a failed test of electromagnetic shielding that killed crew members through unforeseen effects. Perhaps it was research into weapons technology that violated international agreements. Perhaps it was an accident that revealed theoretical physics the Navy wanted to monopolize. What's certain is that the official denials don't withstand scrutiny. The inconsistencies, the pattern of intimidation, the suspicious timing of deaths and document losses, the continued classification after 7 decades, all of it points to an active effort to suppress the truth about something that occurred in Philadelphia during the dark years of World War II. The Navy doth protest too much, and in doing so, they've created the very suspicion they sought to eliminate. The questions remain. Decades after that strange October night in 1943, the Philadelphia experiment refuses to rest in the archives of debunked conspiracy theories. Instead, it lingers in the shadows between documented fact and impossible fiction, haunted by deaths, disappearances, and warnings that echo through the halls of naval installations even today. Morris Ketchum Jessup never lived to explain what he truly believed. The astronomer and author who championed the reality of the experiment was found dead in his car on the evening of April 20th, 1959, a hose running from the exhaust pipe through a cracked window. The official verdict was suicide. Jessup had been depressed, they said, financial troubles, personal problems. But those who knew him remember something else. They remember the annotated copy of his book that had been sent to the Office of Naval Research, filled with detailed commentary about the experiment that seemed to come from someone who had been there. They remember how Jessup became obsessed with those annotations, convinced they held genuine insider knowledge. They remember his cryptic phone calls in the days before his death, his claims that he was close to a breakthrough, that he had learned something that would change everything. And then they remember finding him slumped in that parked car in Dade County, Florida, the engine still running, all his research materials mysteriously vanished. The crew members fade into deeper mystery. Official naval records show no unusual casualties or disappearances from any Philadelphia-based destroyer escort in 1943. Yet the names persist in scattered testimonies and second-hand accounts. Sailors who reportedly phased through solid steel bulkheads and never reformed. Men who walked into the walls of their homes after the war and simply disappeared. Veterans who spent the rest of their lives in psychiatric institutions, speaking in terrified whispers about being caught between dimensions, about seeing their own bodies scattered across time and space. Try to trace these men now, and you'll find only dead ends. Records that should exist but don't. Death certificates with suspiciously vague causes listed. Families who moved away and left no forwarding address. It's as if someone went through the archives with surgical precision, removing every thread that might allow you to pull at the truth. The Philadelphia Naval Shipyard itself whispers its own strange stories. Though much of the facility has been decommissioned and redeveloped, certain areas remain restricted. Maintenance workers and security personnel report compass malfunctions in specific zones, electronic equipment that behaves erratically without explanation, cell phones that lose signal even when towers are clearly visible, GPS devices that show impossible locations or simply freeze. Some nights, they say, there's a low humming sound that seems to come from nowhere and everywhere at once, a vibration you feel in your teeth and bones, rather than hear with your ears. Electromagnetic field detectors go wild in these spots, registering fluctuations that engineers can't explain. The official explanations involve underground power cables and old electrical infrastructure. But the pattern is too localized, too specific. The anomalies cluster in areas that, according to old shipyard maps, align precisely with where destroyer escorts were docked during wartime degaussing operations. Then, there are the warnings. This is perhaps the most unsettling detail of all. Modern Navy veterans, men and women who served decades after the alleged experiment, report something disturbing from their service orientations. During routine briefings at various naval installations, usually late in the session, an officer would make a casual but pointed comment. Don't ask about the Philadelphia incident. Don't go digging into old wartime experiments. Don't talk to civilians about classified research projects, even ones supposedly from the 1940s. The warning was always delivered with the same tone, somewhere between administrative routine and genuine menace. Most sailors laughed it off or forgot about it, but some remembered. They remembered because of the officer's eyes when delivering the warning. They remembered because of how quickly the subject was changed. They remembered because when they later tried to access historical naval records for personal research or academic projects, they found entire sections redacted or simply missing, with no explanation provided. So where does this leave us? The evidence against the Philadelphia experiment is substantial. No ship could have traveled from Philadelphia to Norfolk and back in the time frame alleged. The USS Eldridge's deck logs show it was nowhere near Philadelphia in October of 1943. The physics of the 1940s couldn't possibly have generated the kind of unified field technology the experiment supposedly employed. Carlos Allende, the primary source, was demonstrably unreliable, a storyteller with a troubled mind and a tendency toward elaborate fabrication. The whole thing, skeptics reasonably argue, was a hoax that spiraled out of control, fed by Cold War paranoia, and a public hungry for stories of government secrets. Yet, debunking doesn't quite cover everything, does it? It doesn't explain Morris Jessup's death and the convenient disappearance of his research. It doesn't account for why the Office of Naval Research took those annotated books seriously enough to convene a special meeting about them. It doesn't address the persistent electromagnetic anomalies or the modern military warnings. And it certainly doesn't erase the documented fact that in 1943, the United States military was desperately racing against Nazi Germany to weaponize emerging theories about electromagnetism, radar invisibility, and unified field theory. We know Project Rainbow existed in some form. We know degaussing experiments were conducted. We know that science and ethics took a back seat to military necessity. Perhaps the deeper truth isn't about whether a ship became invisible and teleported across space. Perhaps the real horror is simpler and more human. In 1943, someone conducted experiments with forces they didn't fully understand. They subjected sailors, young men who had volunteered to serve their country, to electromagnetic fields of unprecedented intensity. Maybe those fields didn't open holes in space-time. Maybe they just opened holes in human bodies. Maybe they didn't cause teleportation. Maybe they just caused cancers, neurological damage, and psychological trauma that wouldn't be properly understood for decades. Maybe the cover-up isn't about impossible physics. Maybe it's about something far more mundane and far more damning: the willingness of governments to sacrifice their own people in the name of military advantage. The questions persist. What was Morris Jessup about to reveal? Where did those sailors really go? What experiments continue today under the shield of national security? Who is paying the price right now for research we won't learn about for another 70 years? The Philadelphia experiment remains unsolved, not because we lack information, but because someone ensures we'll never have enough. That certainty, that ongoing active suppression of truth, might be the most terrifying confirmation of all. If they conducted this experiment once, what are they testing now? And when those test subjects start telling their stories, will we listen, or will we simply call them crazy and wait for them to die, just like we did the last time? Nine. That's where this journey ends for tonight. If you made it all the way here, subscribe and hit the bell for more long-form stories like this. Check out the videos on screen for more right now. Drop your own experiences in the comments below. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.